So I spent some time trying to figure out what this video would be about. The thing I wanted to discuss was how many games seem to be going backwards when it comes to development, considering gameplay and the rest of it. The example here is how mechanically Far Cry 2 and Far Cry 5 compare. Things like being able to shoot through tin fences, setting the dry grass on fire were things supported in Far Cry 2, but for some reason, not in Far Cry 5. So the question is, how does this happen? What's making later games in a game franchise worse in terms of gameplay than earlier games? There's a little bit to unpack here. I think these are the main points. Graphically, these games need to keep up with the status quo, meaning making it look nice is the priority. And it may mean that mechanics simply don't work one-to-one because, for example, destruction in a Generation 7 game is not the same as in a Generation 9 title. It demands different art assets entirely. Number 2, there might be shifts that aren't obvious. Maybe the team that made the earlier title is no longer there. It may be up to a completely new team to create the newer title. And number 3, I believe this point not be as obvious, but the underlying way of development itself is wasteful. And it means that very little is actually being carried over and reused in later games. This last point is what I wanted to discuss further. And the game I wanted to talk about was Shadow of the Tomb Raider. The Tomb Raider franchise is one that's been in existence for approaching 30 years. On paper, it should be at the forefront of games in terms of fidelity, gameplay, narrative, and all the rest of it. But it isn't. Let's have a look at this opening environment. To the majority of gamers, I think this looks fine. It features very nice set pieces, has good atmosphere, and overall serves as a tutorial area, teaching the player how to climb and do quick-timey things. Then you move on to the next thing. This kind of development style is repeated throughout the entire game, as well as I think very much the same throughout the franchise's history. And you know what? Shadow of the Tomb Raider isn't alone in this. Many other games in the action-adventure genre follow the same development cycle. Now let's look at a game that does this a little differently. I'm talking about Red Dead Redemption 2 and the larger franchises that Rockstar creates, including Red Dead 1 and the Grand Theft Auto catalog. The more I look at Rockstar and this particular type of production has me respecting them even more. It's one that always gets refined as the later games come out. Sure, there are examples where earlier games supported things that the later games didn't. I think Grand Theft Auto 3 let you use the trains, whereas in Grand Theft Auto 4 you couldn't. Something along those lines. But they've largely been improvements as you look at their games chronologically. So doing the comparison thing. Red Dead Redemption 2 famously spent $1 billion to make and market. The split was something like $500 million for the development itself and another $500 million for marketing. Shadow of the Tomb Raider, in comparison, its development costs between $110 and $135 million. So that means Red Dead Redemption 2 is a little more than 4 times the cost of Tomb Raider. I was quite surprised when I learned this because if you ask me, there's much more content in Red Dead than Tomb Raider. Then you look at the two in terms of gameplay. Tomb Raider is very much that game where you go into a scenario, kill people, and move on, or complete a task and move on. Red Dead has a much more dynamic world entirely, where at any moment you could be met with a predator of some kind. Not to mention they have a dynamic day-night cycle system and dynamic NPC and lawman behavior. If you were to look at Red Dead as a standalone title and asked any other studio to remake it to that same level of quality, I believe it would cost way more than that previous $500 million of development. And I believe this is because these systems that were included in Red Dead were developed years ago, and their development continues as they go into these later games. We're talking about AI pathfinding, lighting and rendering, various weather effects. They've been built up over the years. In summary, what am I trying to say? I think game studios should be making more dynamic worlds. This, for the interactive medium, is what is warranted, and I believe more interesting. Thank you, and catch you next time.